Hey, y'all, welcome to the latest and greatest edition of the Black People Parenting Podcast. I am your host, Dion Glad Dad. And of course, as you know, monthly we do a conversation about the impact and the effects of HIV and AIDS on our community. Today is a special episode. Of course, I got my sidekick with me, or maybe I'm her sidekick, Dr. Bambi Gaddis, who is going to say all of the things that I always forget to say that need to be said so we can remain grounded in why and who we are doing this for. Dr. Gaddis, I will gladly hand it over to you, and then we'll
Good
talk to our
evening.
guest.
I don't know how he could possibly forget this, but Mr. Chavis and I have been working together for a couple of years now, representing the HIV Clinical Trials Network, specifically Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center. We are ambassadors. I am an ambassador with the Faith Initiative, and Mr. Chavis is one of several members of our team who are committed themselves to make sure that we give out accurate information about what is happening in health disparities. In this case, HIV is our focus for this year and the upcoming year. It is still alive and well, and although we've made much progress in treatment and prevention, we still are fighting stigma. We are still fighting areas of this arena that are causing people not only harm, but are impacting their health status. And so tonight, I'm just grateful to have Mr. Matt Martin on, and I'm sure you'll introduce him in his finest hour. He and I have known each other maybe a year, and I've had an opportunity to be in his presence and learn from him and his advocacy work in North Carolina. So this is your homeboy, Mr. Chavis.
Yeah, we live
Uh,
right down the street from each other. We were just talking about that.
exactly. So I'm going to turn it over to you and give thanks for all those who took time to come on.
For sure. Thank you, ma'am. So yeah, let's get into it with our guest and let's talk to Mr. Matt Martin. Matt is the Associate Director of the North Carolina AIDS Action Network. We want to talk about some advocacy that his organization has been doing, some of the hurdles that they have been facing when it comes to the work of bringing awareness to HIV and AIDS, and just kind of have a conversation with him about what it looks like for him in the work that he does. So, Matt, welcome to the show, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all. Excited to be here.
Yeah. So, talk to us a little bit about how you got, first and foremost, how you got into the work that you do. I know you have a background in music, you have a background in education. Talk to me a little about how you transitioned into working in this field of HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, so definitely kind of a non-traditional route. So my degree is in music education. I went to Western Carolina University and got a degree in instrumental music education after graduating college. I taught in the North Carolina public school system for 2 years and very quickly learned that that is just not the path that I needed to be on. I love education, I love music, but very quickly learned that's not where I needed to be. Around the same time that I started teaching was also around the time that I really came into my own and started coming out as a queer person. And I think through that, as opposed to kind of like jumping into um, the getting to know people side of my identity, I really turned to activism as a way to start making friends and start kind of like building my muscle within the queer community. So I started doing a lot of advocacy and activism and volunteering through that, which ultimately led to me leaving my job and pursuing some kind of work in activism. I did an issue-based campaign back in 2015 that ultimately led to the passage of Charlotte's non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ folks, which ultimately led to the passage of House Bill 2 as kind of like a punishment for what Charlotte did to protect LGBTQ folks, which many folks remember HB2 as the bathroom bill in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then so from that campaign, started doing some organizing around HB2 and trying to overturn that ruling. And then that just kind of led to this work. And I've been here at NCAN and AIDS Action Network since August of 2016, hard to believe, a little over 8 years, and have really kind of grown in my knowledge of activism and organizing through HIV. And I think HIV is just such an important topic for queer people, for people who are like me, for people who are not like me, to kind of like learn the history of our communities, of working together, of having our voices heard. And I think it's taught me a lot of the intersectionality of how many people are impacted by HIV, and has really, I think, guided kind of what I hope to do long term.
Yeah. So how has your work in education and the work that you've done previously, as a field organizer, how has that informed your approach to building the coalitions and engaging in different communities?
Good question. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I am, even though I'm no longer like officially an educator by title, I think I'm like a lifelong educator. And I think a lot of how I approach things in the classroom, of like hitting people from different angles to make sure that we are meeting like the full person and folks are able to learn in their best way. I take a lot of that into my organizing, into how I kind of approach all of my work. I kind of consider myself like a passenger seat organizer. It's not for me to like come into a space where I may not be from, that may not be my community, may not be people that I am with day in, day out. But to come into those spaces, show folks what resources I have, and maybe able to help them in whatever they're trying to work for, because they're the experts of their own community and their own lives. So I think that is a lot of how I kind of use my education background. I also really enjoy, as an advocacy and policy organization, policy is one of those things that can be really wonky and kind of like push people away. People don't really want to talk about policy because it sounds a little bit lofty and outside of their kind of day to day. And I like taking the kind of like nitty gritty of policy and bringing it down to terms so that folks can understand the impact that policy has on them and how they can be involved in the policy making decision. And I think my education kind of really
that sounds so politically correct, the way you put that, because being transparent, and this is an unfortunate observation, I could be wrong, and you can feel free to clarify for me. I find that the average person really doesn't understand policy at all. They live in a world, they live in a community, they go to a church that's totally dictated by people in authority making decisions about how they function from day to day in their everyday life, in their spiritual life, etc. But they never question authority. It's so often they don't even know who's representing them. People that are making these decisions about their children, them, their grands and great grands, they have no clue. And so I'm assuming that there is this threshold that you have to first meet in getting everyday people to engage or come together to discuss issues like the one that we're embarking on tonight, which is on criminalizing people who have a specific health disparity that's federally sanctioned as a disability. In this case, HIV, AIDS. We refer mostly to HIV infection, but having HIV, where it is, to my knowledge, the only infection, the only disease, if that's the word we use, that has a backdrop of going to prison, where somebody can be detained, someone can be arrested, put in a county jail, and subsequently imprisoned for a period of time. When Mr. Chavis and I were when we started talking about the work you're doing in North Carolina, I was reflecting on your presentation here in South Carolina at the event that was hosted by the USC School of Medicine, their training network, and DHEC, or now what is known as Department of Public Health. And there I sat as a citizen of South Carolina, right, where you're telling me that of all the achievements, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that you all have made in North Carolina, right? Listen to someone from Georgia who was on a pathway to try to work through their criminalization of people living with HIV. And there we all sat, a room full of providers, and our progress has been nil, or we haven't made really any progress in the conversation to date, although we're optimistic. So with that being said, I looked at our laws here, and for those who may be listening, let me be specific. It's Title 44, which goes back to, as a citizen, do I know how to even look up a law? Okay, so Title 44, Chapter 29 is one section that came to mind. Section 145. So let me repeat that. It's 44-29-140. And then there was one other that I want to cite, Section 44-29-145. Simply state, if I have an STI, if I have gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, etc., and I by chance transmit that to someone, and I'll use the term knowingly, the penalty for that is what? $200 and potentially 30-day imprisonment. But HIV in South Carolina, and there's some more detail, I'm leaving a lot out of this, but the short version is, if someone were to what they call unlawfully transmit the virus to someone, the fine is $5,000. So it jumped from $200 to $5,000 with a prison penalty of no more than 10 years, going from 30 days to 10 years. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective in North Carolina, when were your laws made? And when did people realize that these laws were out of date, not aligned with science, not aligned with the new prevention methods? And somebody said, what are we doing? Why are we putting people with HIV in jail? When did that start, that conversation begin?
Yeah, so couple of different things. So I think our specific law was written in 1988, I believe, and had not been updated since 1988. So I think around 2015, 2016, I think is where we really started to see kind of a nationwide movement of people who are living with HIV who really started to push back on these really archaic laws. Like, why are we being criminalized just solely because of our HIV status? Why are we the only health condition that's being criminalized because of our specific health condition? So I think we kind of saw the movement kind of nationally and started thinking through internally, like 2015, 2016, what is the process? What would it look like for North Carolina? We know that our laws are outdated. What do we need to do to kind of change that here? And then I think it was kind of divine intervention, you may say, that in 2017, we learned that all of our public health code law was up for review. So it seemed like a really logical time for us to create a work group of folks, of people who are living with HIV, of providers, people who work in other HIV policy spaces, to kind of start thinking through, what does our law currently look like? What could it look like, and what do we want to submit for public health comment?
What did it look like? What did it look like before you started the work group?
So it was very wordy, as you mentioned, like with the South Carolina laws, like you got to kind of water it down because otherwise it would be pages and pages and pages. The kind of gist of it was any person who is living with HIV must disclose their HIV status to every sexual partner, and a person who is living with HIV must always use a condom in any sexual encounter. Otherwise, you could be charged. I believe it was a misdemeanor and up to 2 years in prison. So not nearly as severe in punishment as South Carolina with the up to 10-year charge. And not a felony. It was a misdemeanor and up to 2 years imprisonment. But it always required disclosure of your HIV status and always required using a condom. There was also something around not allowing for folks with HIV to donate organs, which we can talk more about kind of what our law change looked like. But those were kind of like the big buckets of what it required and being outside of those laws was punishable by up to 2 years in prison.
So, okay, so for folks who, there's a couple things that I want to unpack. So, Dr. Gaddis, you said some things in that pertain to the law. So these laws are state mandated laws, meaning that they vary from state to state. The law that Matt is talking about here in North Carolina could be different than a law that's in North Dakota, or vice versa. So Matt, I want to know from you, and Dr. Bambi, you talked about the disparities or the differences between other STIs and HIV and AIDS as pertains to these laws. What was the logic or the reasoning behind, in your opinion, Matt, these laws taking effect?
When they were originally written?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's what I think the original thought was, and then what I think was like really behind that thought, right? So the original thought was, HIV is here, people are dying rapidly, we need to stop people from spreading HIV. That was the thought, to stop the spread, right? Like that's how they kind of masked it. The real answer to that is there was a massive amount of stigma around HIV toward people in the 80s and 90s who had HIV, were acquiring HIV and potentially transmitting HIV. And they were like, what can we do to, for lack of a better word, get rid of these people? What can we do to keep this thing under wraps, to not have to talk about it, and to push these folks further into the margins so that we don't have to deal with it anymore, and to keep our communities safe, I'm sure is probably a lot of kind of the rhetoric that was spread. So I think it was this like really antithetical way of developing public health laws to try and keep the spread of HIV from happening, but in doing so was just pushing people further and further and further into them.
I want to add something to that. The other thing that continues, in my opinion, to circle around this conversation of whether we're going to what we call modernize HIV law is that there's these people out here that are doing it on purpose. There's these people out here who've been doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. And honestly, they deserve what they get. But we have to think of the masses. And so we have to come up with these laws that for these people who are going to deliberately give it to somebody, we need to penalize them. And back in the 80s, because if you look at the language in the law, in these laws initially, they always speak to someone who deliberately, intentionally, they use those words, deliberately, intentionally exposing others to what they're using in South Carolina as terms like venereal diseases. That is still in the books. We don't even use the terminology. So even the terminology lends itself toward, so the words that I'm looking at are very specific to incarceration. They're very punitive. They vary penalties, words like penalties, exposing. And so that's the hard part of what Matt and what we're talking about when we talk about advocacy. How do we introduce new language? How we, and the reality is that there are some people who have willingly and knowingly shared or exposed someone. But the reality is that that's not the scenario for most people. And when you look at a virus that takes 7 to 10 years to even show itself, that I can get HIV and not even have a sign or a symptom for 7 to 10 years down the road, my God, how would one know? So it's more likely that we have people who could potentially be incarcerated, who don't know their status, don't know the status of people they've been with intimately, didn't do it on purpose because they didn't even know they have it. But now, because their name has been placed on a list, they have to prove that they didn't know, or they may have to prove that they told someone, but they can't document that they shared the information in transparency. Does that make sense, Dion?
Yes, yes, yes. No, I'm asking also from a perspective of someone who lives a life that, I got a 20-year-old daughter, right? So a lot of my days are spent worrying and wondering about what's going on. And one of the things I asked this question because one of the things that I remember seeing last school year was that there was a young man, I believe in North Carolina, who was knowingly infecting uh, partners with HIV, who was going around and, having sex all willy nilly with the intent of infecting others with HIV. So my question is, in the work that you do, Matt, in the advocacy that you do, is there a gray area where we say we do recognize that there are folks who have malicious intent in what they do? There is, even if it's a very small segment of the population, there are people out there who are willing to say, okay, you know what? I don't care about anyone else's life. My intent is to go out here and infect other people with what we've all thought for a very long time was a disease that could that would kill you, right, Dr. G? We've talked over the last couple of months about how there's PrEP and it can be undetectable and all those things. Now, my thought is that that average person doesn't know that, right? That person that we talk about who doesn't necessarily watch TV and see the PrEP commercials, they just think that HIV is a death sentence. If they're going out and saying, I'm going to infect someone else with this disease, does the work that you do, Matt, give any leeway for that? Right? You know what I mean? Like, because there are people who have malicious intent.
Yeah. This is kind of a tricky question for me because, like, yes, I think that there could be people with malicious intent, but I think when we look at the 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States, that's just not the case for the vast majority of folks.
For sure.
But I mean, I think what we are seeing kind of in law change, and so I'll say, like, our law change was in 2017, 2018. And since then has had room for improvement. But I think when we think through, for a lot of advocates across the country, for what the gold standard of, like, what laws would look like, I think a lot of what we talk about is intent to transmit and actual transmission occurring, I think, are kind of what the laws that are kind of making the best kind of headway to ensure that those two things are included in the law. And kind of like you do risk prosecution if you intended to transmit and a specific transmission has occurred, which I think helps to protect folks who may not know their status and then may have transmitted to someone unintentionally and with no malice. So I think really having those two things would be key to what's the word that I'm looking for? Kind of prevent the bad seeds from happening, like the malice from occurring. But it is still tricky because it's just we have to think about the full. And I mean, that also leads to stigma, right? Like, though that may happen, it's such a super rare case, but then we also associate all the 1.2 million people with HIV with one person who may do something out of malice, in the same way that, like, it's one of those, it's a slippery slope, but I think the intent to transmit and actual transmission occurring are kind of the two things that.
One of the things that I found intriguing when Matt was presenting last week, it had to do with where the laws of North Carolina were housed. So in his case, the laws were couched or protected or infused under the Department of Health for North Carolina, where Georgia's laws and South Carolina's laws are governed by the legislature. So they made those laws in the legislature and they enforce or set a precedent for enforcement of those laws in local counties and et cetera throughout the state from a legislative body. But that's not what Matt had to deal with. Can you talk about the difference between what were the advantages or disadvantages of you addressing this major criminalization issue, but it being housed out of legislative authority versus under the authority of public health?
Yeah. So, I mean, as Dr. Gaddis alluded to, ours lives within what is called the Commission for Public Health here in North Carolina, which is like a governing body of health professionals from across the state who help guide public health law, which I think for us was largely an advantage because it's people who are working in health who understand the nuances of healthcare, who are helping to kind of move forward laws as it pertains to the health of people in North Carolina. Whereas with legislatures, it's a lot different. You have to find someone who's a champion. You have to find somebody who's interested in what you're talking about. You have to know how to navigate those conversations. So I think for us, that was a benefit, especially here in the South where, I mean, frankly, whenever you start talking about HIV, it's a lot oftentimes associated with LGBTQ policy, which can lead to really heinous laws that people in the South want to advance. So it can be a lot harder to advance those type of laws, particularly when you're thinking about like criminalization type of reform in a Southern legislature. So I think we had the benefit of working with a public health commission of people who were thinking through the health and well-being of North Carolina as opposed to kind of like political gain, so to speak. Which is not to say we have certainly done a lot of legislative change and have had to deal with the struggles of that. But I think us having to go the public health law routes made it easier for us, and for the year in 2017 made it attainable. I don't think it's something that if it lived in our legislature, honestly, we would have been able to advance in 2017. I don't know if we would still be able to advance in 2024. It could be something we were still working on or had to do a lot more incrementally. But that it's definitely a difference of the type of advocacy, how it goes about, and kind of the big changes that happen as opposed to the legislature.
Did you have anybody in the work group who had been incarcerated because of
I not somebody from North Carolina in the work group, but there was someone else from a national organization who had been incarcerated. Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit because Matt, you touched on, and Dr. Gaddis, you touched on politics and policy. So I want to kind of fast forward from where we were and kind of go to where we are. Because Matt, you talked about 2024, and I was looking at some of the things that our North Carolina politicians are doing to advance their agenda in this Hurricane Helene relief bill in terms of education and things like that. So I want to know, Matt, and I know you're not a fortune teller. I know you're not a.
I wish I was.
What's the other? What do the people call it? I know you're not a psychic, right? But I want you to tell me, if you can, what are some of the, if there are any, there may not. I don't want to jump the gun. So let me ask this question first. From your perspective, are there any areas of concern within the LGBTQ community with the incoming administration? I'll start there. That would be a yes. Okay.
A blanket statement, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think both in less so in North Carolina with the way that our kind of like heads of state are shaping up, and the fact that we no longer have a supermajority come January after the elections does not stop a lot of folks who are anti-LGBT from trying to push that type of rhetoric. But I do think luckily we have both a governor and attorney general who are going to do a lot to hopefully help folks who are LGBTQ in North Carolina. I do think when we think nationally, queer folks are frankly terrified right now.
Tell me why.
A lot of different reasons. I think trans folks in particular and gender affirming care and the bans on that. And I mean, just what was it that just happened a couple days ago of the House member who's trying to advance legislation? There's a trans person from Delaware who was just elected to Congress and is now trying to prohibit her from using
the bathroom.
Like it's just this dehumanizing. I mean, similar to what happened in the 80s with these HIV laws. Like, it was to dehumanize and stigmatize people with HIV in the same way that these laws are being written to dehumanize and stigmatize queer folks. I mean, there's a plethora. I mean, we've already seen health bans across the South. North Carolina has a trans health ban. I have friends who are having to take their children across the border to have their gender affirming care. And it's like, what are we going to do if this continues on? If we see more nationwide bans, I think it's really scary for queer people right now.
So
let me just add this real quick. The other thing that we're concerned about is
Dr. G.
I'm sorry.
Hold on one second, because I believe in saying the thing and speaking for people who may not know. So Matt, I want you said the phrase gender affirming care, right? And I want to be sure that everyone who is watching this knows exactly what gender affirming care is, because I myself am someone who just probably within the last 6 to 9 months learned what that term means. So I want you to define what gender affirming care is, and if you have time, go into why it's important.
Yeah. So I mean, the bare bones definition of what gender affirming care is care that makes you feel yourself in your body. I think that is like the base. Gender affirming care is health care that makes you feel yourself in your body. And a very clear example of gender affirming care that I think often gets conflated and would not be assigned to gender affirming care. If an older gentleman who has a receding hairline gets a hair transplant, that's gender affirming care. It is whatever you need to do to feel best in your body. And I think what we have heard, the rhetoric that we've heard, particularly around trans kids, is that these adolescents are receiving these irreversible surgeries that changes their biology and changes their body chemistry at school, right? And largely the main thing that we see for trans young folks under 18 is the administration of puberty blockers that delays puberty until they are of adult age to make decisions of their own bodies, with their families, with their providers, that best fit their gender and expressing who they need to be in their own body. That's
these blockers would be illegal.
Yes.
To give a child a blocker to delay onset of adolescence would be deemed under this regime illegal.
And in many places already is, unfortunately, by state mandate. Yeah.
Okay. So again, I wanted to throw that out there because I believe that it's important for folks to be educated on some of these terms that we hear. And sometimes we just kind of go about our day and we hear the terms and we don't ask, or we don't know who to ask. We don't have anyone to ask what that term means. So gender affirming care is one of those terms that I think that it's important that we know what it means. Like, what is the definition? Like not what we're being told it is by politicians, or not being told that it's kids going to school one day and they're a boy and coming back home and they're a girl. Like, that's not what it is, and that's not what it looks like. Dr. G, you were going to say something.
You talked about the impact on the LGBT community. What about this? What conversations are you having with physicians? Because as I understand the law, it's not just the people who are requesting or in the consultation of their parents and or a flat out adult making a decision about their care, there are penalties in many of these laws on physicians if they provide the service. So what's happening with that in North Carolina? So you have this restructuring or HIV modernization of the law. How has it impacted the providers? How will it impact providers? Are they at threat for incarceration?
Specifically to HIV care?
Let's just say they offer and provide a hormone to a child, whether, and assuming it's under the guidance of a caregiver, a parent, or a guardian, and they give it to them, will they potentially be incarcerated?
I don't want to speak on a topic that I'm not super familiar with. I know that pieces of legislation have passed in the past couple of years in North Carolina that prohibits gender affirming care for minors. So I'm sure there's some type of punishment for providers who were to do that. I just don't know what that is, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But we'd be happy to get that information. But I am sure that there is some type of maybe either losing a license or whatever it may be for providers. Yeah.
In the work that you do, Matt, what gaps are you seeing that still exist here in the state of North Carolina when it comes to HIV and AIDS advocacy? Where are the gaps? Like, what do you think that we can start doing more? What areas?
Sadly, I think there's a lot. I think that the biggest thing that kind of comes to mind for me is just overall access to healthcare for people, particularly in rural parts of our state. So when you look at like our HIV, what is the word that I'm looking for? Prevalence throughout North Carolina. There's kind of like two big areas that we kind of see the highest prevalence. So that's like our I-85 corridor in North Carolina, which is like the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, going into like the Greensboro, Winston-Salem area down to Charlotte. So kind of our like bigger cities, higher population. We always see higher prevalence in larger cities in our areas. And then also in North Carolina is our I-95 corridor, which is the eastern part of the state, which is more rural, and also where we have a really high folks of color population in those areas.
Like Rocky Mount and Roanoke Rapids,
Fayetteville, Greenville, down that I-95 corridor. And that is largely because a lot of those areas are care deserts. There are many people that we've worked with and talked with that to get to an HIV provider have to drive upwards of like an hour and a half to 2 hours. So if there's not an HIV care provider, there's sure not to be an HIV testing person or somewhere where they can easily go and access an HIV test. So like, how are folks supposed to know their status? And then once they do know their status, not everybody can take an hour and a half to go to a doctor to get on their treatment. So that's one of the things that kind of like keeps me up at night and constantly thinking like, how do we address these huge barriers of just geography in North Carolina? North Carolina is a huge state. I don't think people realize that it's like 10 hours from tip to tip in North Carolina. It's a big state, and especially our more rural spaces, it's a really long drive for a lot of folks to get to care. So that's for the treatment side of things. I think similar to that, we're also seeing people not having access to prevention services in the same way. Those same places where folks don't have access to care and testing also don't have access to prevention services, whether it be PrEP or a place to go and get condoms or whatever it may be. It's the same situation where they've got to drive upwards of an hour, hour and a half to get care. So that's a really big issue. And then, I think we luckily have seen a big increase in health coverage in North Carolina with the expansion of Medicaid last year, with well over 500,000 people now being able to access Medicaid.
Which South Carolina does not have.
No, they do not. And hopefully they will follow suit someday. There's still so many people who don't have access to healthcare because that only provided healthcare for that 36% between 100% of the federal poverty line, 136% of the federal poverty line. So there's still a huge number of people who don't have access to care, or if they do have access to care, can't afford their medications, can't afford to go to the doctor when they need to, can't afford to see a specialist, have medical debt from being in the hospital. So I think those are kind of like the two big bucket things. And then I think a lot of things kind of trickle down from there when it comes to general access to care.
Now, how are you all, and when I say you all, I mean your organization, how are you all addressing some of these disparities that we're seeing? Like you said, the eastern part of North Carolina is, kind of separated from, where we are here in the Raleigh-Durham area. And then here in Raleigh-Durham, we're kind of separated from, the Asheville's and the more mountainous areas. So what does it look like for you all to go out into these areas and serve these folks? Like, what role are you playing, and are you all playing in making sure that, I guess the playing field is even, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, it's a little bit different because we're not like a direct service provider. We do only the advocacy and policy side of things, but I do think that we try and ensure that people from those areas who are on the ground doing that direct service and providing those services to folks have a voice and are helping us guide the policies that ultimately will impact their communities. And that means a lot of times just like showing up and listening to what they need and then kind of translating that and teaching them also, I think, is really big, how to be advocates for policy change and how to speak to a representative about things that are really important for them. And then I think it's just thinking really as strategically as we can, like what can we do within our legislature to remedy some of these barriers to care? What are some strategic things that we can do to increase access to testing in these rural areas where they may not have it? Maybe that's a self-collect test that they can do at home and then send in, teleprep or meeting with a doctor via satellite or mobile clinics. I mean, there's a whole lot of different things we have to think through, but I think it's largely just kind of showing up in those spaces and then lending whatever help we can provide to help folks bring them into the advocacy fold and then really become their own advocates for themselves and their communities.
Well, I'm not sure if you recall last week when you were presenting, remember there was a conversation that ensued about when should we tell someone that tests positive the implications now that you know. And the conversation was not a debate, but it was an exchange of ideas of where one person said you should not tell them at the time that they are diagnosed and you share their status and tell them they're now a person living with HIV. You should give them a couple of weeks to get it in their head. And yesterday we had a webinar with a young man who was very enlightening us about his journey in and out of care. And he talked very candidly about what it was like being diagnosed, what it was like, what was his response to it, and subsequently where he's been. And one of the things he made, we walked away from is one, when he was first told, he thought it was a mistake because his partner who went with him was negative. And he subsequently wasn't told till days later that he had tested positive. So in this small period of time, they still expressed intimacy with one another, believing that there was an error in the diagnosis. But the other part that was most profound is we specifically asked him, based on our conversation at the conference, did anybody talk to you? Did anybody present the laws to you at that time of the diagnosis? Should they have, etc.? And his response was enlightening. He said, first of all, no one ever said a word to him. That it was far into his, when he decided to show back up in care, which was 6 months after the diagnosis, that even then no one said anything to him. And in his journey of experimenting back and forth with whether he was going to stay in care, no one still said anything. And so we asked him point blank, should we, should you have that information, or should we give you time to process the diagnosis? And if I heard him correctly, and I believe I did, he said he should have been told. He should have been told at that moment, that so he understood walking away. Now, personally, as a professional, I had some concerns about how the information was given. The negative implications of how, the test results were given. And so clearly how we give results means everything. But what he affirmed for me was that our tradition and the organization that I headed to tell people that day, at that time, what the laws of South Carolina were. Mm-hmm. Now that you're living with HIV, he edified that that's something that he deserved and that he should have been told. So he understood the magnitude of the diagnosis. What were your thoughts on that? You didn't weigh in, but I'm asking you to weigh in now.
Yeah, I mean, I think all I can say is, like, as someone who is not a person living with HIV and has never had that given to me, I would like to think that if I was to go through that, I'm the type of person that whenever I'm given information, I want to know everything I can as soon as I can. And I am probably going to go in spirals, and I'm going to go down rabbit holes, and I'm going to dwell on it, and it's going to spike my anxiety. But I mean, I think if someone has a diagnosis, I feel like they have the right to know everything they can about how their life could or could not change. And I think particularly as cold as it may sound, like, if you are at risk of prosecution because of your health status now, you have a right to know, like, this could happen to you. And I think people need all of the information and education they can as soon as they're able to hear it. And I think maybe it's a matter of, like, how we're transmitting the message, who is giving that message. But I do think it's important that people have all of the information that they need, especially when it comes to their lives and their livelihood and how it's truly going to impact them as an individual.
So in these last few minutes that we have with you, it's like, for people like me, there's individuals all over this state who showed up in that room last week who are just like, how can we get with the program here?
Did she freeze up for you, man?
Say that again.
No, I think,
Dion?
Dr. G, you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You froze up for me.
Oh, Matt can't hear me. Let me just state my question. What do you recommend to people like us who haven't made much progress today? We do have some interesting things that are being embarked upon, but I'm not at freedom to discuss it because the leadership, you said we needed a champion. We believe we have, I believe we found a champion. I believe there's someone else who would consider being a co-champion. But until we get the full consensus, we're not privy to put names out there. But that being said, what would you recommend to us as a state who are light years behind North Carolina at this point? Because you all also have needle exchange, correct?
Yes, yeah.
You have needle exchange, which prevents HIV transmission from people who inject drugs. You have Medicaid expansion, which, for the record, I was told by the champion that you are looked upon as a Democratic entity. So that may or may not work touting your progress. That is what I was told. But being the bipartisan person that I'm trying to be, what recommendations do you have for us as we move forward in trying to get to where Georgia is and where you have been?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I would say, well, there's kind of a couple of things. So first and foremost, I cannot stress enough the importance of working in coalition with other folks, particularly in South Carolina when you're thinking about the criminalization of HIV, ensuring that people who are living with HIV are front and center and leading that conversation, and specifically how these laws can and do impact their everyday lives. And what these mean, what would the ideal law look like? What do you want to see within your state? So I think that's the first big thing, is like creating coalition led by people who are living with HIV, who are guiding the conversation as to what they want to see. With that, I think it's important to think of ideals of like where we want to go, and then also look at the reality of what our political climate is and what incremental change can look like. Understanding that whether we like it or not, concessions are going to have to be made. We're going to have to give up on some things that we think are really important, or hope to advance things that don't go through 1 year or the next year. So just be really, really cognizant that like it's not all going to be exactly what we want it to be, and it's going to be incremental. It could sometimes not happen at all. It can be a years-long battle, and I think that's okay. And people need to know what they're getting into. And then I think, like you said, what you're working on is find somebody within your legislative body who is willing to stand up for the community and really lead this effort, especially someone, and this is the hard part, is finding someone who is willing to be a champion and who has pull to actually get legislation to pass. It's great to have a champion who's going to be a rah-rah for your cause, but if they don't have the means,
so we need
the legislature,
a baller, somebody who's got power, somebody who's
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can find those. And sometimes it's people that you don't think that you will have a single thing in common with. And you'll sit down in a conversation and be like, I can't believe this is a conversation that we're having right now, but here we are, and you're going to be our champion, and we are going to just lean on you and have conversations with you and be open and honest with you about what we need and how we can get there. I think that's kind of
there.
Yeah.
We've been working on it. I think we're almost there. They seem to be that person.
And it's not easy. It's not easy. And here's something else that I will say. I think when working with champions who may be non-traditional champions, this is something that I've learned. Not everyone needs to be in every room. And I think sometimes that means keeping people who are the most marginalized. They're not always the safest in those rooms, because things can be said to people that are really harmful and really damaging. Also need to work with those legislators if you're hoping to get any kind. And that feels so gross to say as like a progressive minded leftist person. It feels gross to say that like we need to have conversations with people that we don't agree with, but in a nonpartisan organization or a nonpartisan topic, you have to talk to everybody, and you're not going to get anywhere if you're only talking to people who are your best friends and believe with you 100% of the time.
Yeah, that's a good way to close us out. Perfect information from Matt. Matt, if folks want to get involved with you and your organization and the work that you're doing and advocating.
What is your organization anyway?
Yeah, look us up, NC AIDS Action Network. You can find us on our website at ncaan.org. We're on Instagram and X, maybe, I think at NC AIDS Action.
Did he say
come on over to Threads
or Blue Sky
or Blue Sky, right?
What is your position at NC at the task force? What's your official position?
My title is associate director, and that is a glorified way of saying jack of all trades, master of absolutely none.
Yeah, whatever.
I'm anything that anybody needs me to be.
Who's your CEO or your ED, or who is your leadership?
Yeah, our executive director is Valeria Levy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're a small but mighty team.
How many are
there
on your
are team? 4 full-time, 2 part-time. So we're small but mighty, doing best we can.
Well, I want to give a shout out to the mighty of the AIDS task force, because you all have really transformed some things. So, Mr. Chavis, you want to close us out?
Yes, ma'am. I will close this out. Matt, thank you for the work that you have done, the work that you are doing, and the work that you will continue to do. I know this road will not be easy going forward due to some of the things that we talked about and the most nonpartisan way that I could say it. I mean, I'm not nonpartisan, so I don't have to mince any words, but I just want to be sure that I'm not stepping on anyone's toes, Dr. Gaddis. So Matt, keep up the good work. We appreciate you. You gave us how we can contact you. Dr. Gaddis and I will be back at some point, maybe not next month, but at some point we will be back having these conversations. So thank you. We appreciate it. We'll see you all on the next episode.
Thank you all so much.
We'll be back in touch, Matt.